Douglas adjusted his tie in the reflection of the mirror, the faint hum of morning traffic seeping through the half-open window. He smiled, almost instinctively, as he thought about Anne bustling in the kitchen, humming her favorite tune while preparing breakfast. On the surface, everything looked perfect: a warm home, laughter spilling over the table, and the reassuring rhythm of routine. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, a flicker of something unspoken lingered whenever his eyes met Fabio's across the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it made Douglas's chest tighten in a way that startled him. Moments like this, brief as they were, carried an electricity he couldn't yet name, nor dare to fully acknowledge. Fabio, on the other side of the living room, straightened a stack of magazines, forcing himself to smile at Andrea's teasing remark about his early morning grumpiness. The familiar warmth of family life wrapped around him like a cozy blanket, and he cherished it. Yet he couldn't ignore the small, quick glances exchanged with Douglas whenever no one else was looking. There was an unspoken rhythm building between them, a silent conversation carried in eye contact and half smiles. Every laugh shared at the dinner table, every casual brush of hands while passing plates, seemed loaded with a secret weight. It made Fabio's pulse stutter in moments of private awareness, leaving him both exhilarated and anxious. The realization that something might be growing between them hovered like a delicate mist, impossible to ignore, yet equally impossible to name aloud. Outside, the morning sun spilled golden light across manicured lawns, children's laughter echoing from the nearby park. Anne waved at a neighbor, her eyes lighting up with a practiced cheerfulness, while Andrea arranged flowers in the living room, a soft smile playing on her lips. From the street, these were families who had it all together, the picture of calm, happy lives. But inside, within the quiet exchanges and fleeting moments, Douglas and Fabio carried a tension that neither wanted to disrupt. Each knew, deep down, that these stolen glances and lingering conversations were the beginning of something unpredictable. And just as the coffee brewed in the kitchen, rich and inviting, so too did a new awareness stir quietly in their hearts, setting the stage for what was to come. Later that evening, the living room was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Douglas sank into the armchair, a glass of wine in hand, listening to Anne recount her day with effortless enthusiasm. He nodded along, yet his mind wandered to Fabio, imagining the curve of his smile, the way his voice had lingered in a private joke earlier. It was confusing, thrilling, and terrifying all at once. Douglas chastised himself for even thinking it, but the tension in his chest refused to subside, demanding attention. He wasn't alone in this quiet storm. Fabio sat across the street, pacing slightly as Andrea chatted on about mundane errands, oblivious to the pulse of energy that ran between the two men. Fabio's thoughts tumbled in a rush of guilt and desire. He wanted to shake it off, to bury it beneath the comfort of familiarity. But the memory of Douglas's eyes caught in that fleeting moment earlier was too vivid. He remembered the laugh they had shared over a trivial comment, the way their hands had brushed ever so lightly when passing a tray, and the heat of awareness that followed. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on Andrea's words, on the warmth of her hand in his, but the pull toward Douglas lingered stubbornly. It was more than curiosity. It was a quiet awakening, one that seemed to whisper promises of understanding, of connection, of something neither could name yet, but both sensed. A soft breeze drifted through the slightly open windows, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the garden outside. Anne's laughter floated in, mingling with the low hum of evening city life, and Andrea's gentle sigh as she finally sank into the sofa beside Fabio. It should have felt ordinary, serene even, but both men experienced it differently, each haunted by a subtle tension they could neither fully express nor completely deny. There was a silent question lingering between them, an invisible thread tugging insistently at the edges of their carefully ordered lives. And as they sipped their wine, pretending to be absorbed in mundane chatter, the air seemed charged with a quiet anticipation, hinting that the ordinary could shift at any moment. The weekend brought its usual rhythm of family gatherings and errands. Yet for Douglas, the familiar sights felt strangely sharper: Anne's laughter, the clink of plates, the the scent of freshly baked bread. It all seemed to highlight the undercurrent of longing he could no longer ignore. Fabio appeared equally absorbed in the routines of life, but there was a spark in his eyes whenever Douglas looked his way, a secret acknowledgement of something neither dared speak aloud. They navigated the day like tightrope walkers, careful, deliberate, yet drawn toward each other in ways that made the air between them hum. Even in shared silences, their minds seemed to converse more freely than in any spoken words, a dangerous intimacy growing in the quiet. In the park, children's shrieks and laughter echoed around them, blending with the rustling of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. Douglas and Fabio exchanged a glance that lasted a heartbeat too long, a small, private acknowledgement hidden beneath layers of civility. The sensation was intoxicating, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that left their hearts racing and palms tingling. They found themselves lingering in conversations with each other just a moment longer than necessary, words loaded with double meanings and unspoken confessions. It was like walking through a familiar room and suddenly noticing doors that had been there all along, secret passages leading somewhere dangerous and thrilling. That evening, as the sky softened into a deep indigo and the city lights flickered to life, Douglas poured himself a second glass of wine and let his gaze drift to the window. Across the street, Fabio's silhouette moved behind the curtain, a subtle shadow that seemed to echo his own feelings. The unspoken connection pulsed quietly between them, each aware yet carefully hiding the truth. It was a delicate tension, fragile as spun glass, and the possibility of discovery lingered, teasing and terrifying in equal measure. As night fell and the household settled into its usual quiet, the thought remained: some bonds, once recognized, cannot simply be ignored. And somewhere in that awareness, a chapter of their lives was just beginning to stir. The days that followed carried a quiet intensity, like the calm before a storm. Douglas found himself checking his phone more often than usual, half hoping, half dreading a message from Fabio. Each ping sent his heart into a flutter, each silence weighing heavier than the last. At work, at home, in fleeting moments between meetings and meals, his mind wandered to Fabio's laugh, the curve of his shoulder, the way he listened so attentively. There was a magnetic pull that both terrified and thrilled him, a recognition that this connection went far beyond fleeting desire. It was as if, in every ordinary glance or brief touch, the world had shifted imperceptibly, leaving him teetering on the edge of something irresistible and forbidden. Fabio felt the same restless energy gnawing at him, a mix of anticipation and guilt that made everyday life feel surreal. He caught himself smiling at private jokes, replaying small gestures over and over in his mind, and wondering how far this silent connection could stretch before it broke the boundaries of their carefully constructed lives. He loved Andrea. Yes, but the depth of feeling for Douglas was different, profound in a way that scared him. Every text they exchanged, every whispered word shared under the guise of casual conversation, seemed to affirm a reality that both thrilled and unsettled them. It was no longer just curiosity. It was emotional, undeniable, a bond that demanded acknowledgement, whether the world approved or not. Evenings became a delicate dance of subtle encounters. Moments when Douglas and Fabio could be themselves without the weight of expectation pressing down. A shared coffee, a lingering laugh over a trivial memory, or a brief touch that lasted just a heartbeat too long. Each instance stoked the quiet fire that simmered between them. Alone in their thoughts, both men wrestled with a complex mix of guilt, fear, and hope. Could this attraction survive the scrutiny of the world? Could they face the inevitable fallout if anyone discovered the truth? The questions hung in the air like a storm cloud on the horizon, but neither could deny the undeniable pull drawing them closer with every heartbeat. One rainy evening, Douglas and Fabio found themselves walking side by side under the glow of streetlights, umbrellas barely shielding them from the drizzle. Conversation was light, casual on the surface, but beneath it flowed a current of unspoken tension and longing. Each laugh shared seemed to linger. Each glance held just a second too long. The sound of rain tapping against their umbrellas became a private rhythm, masking the quickening of their hearts. In these rare moments of solitude away from their families, the walls they'd built around themselves wavered, and for a fleeting instant, they could simply be. Fabio's mind spun with conflicting emotions as he glanced at Douglas. He wanted to step closer, to voice what had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks, yet the weight of responsibility and fear held him back. Andrea's face flashed in his memory, her warmth, her trust, and he hated himself for the distraction he felt whenever Douglas was near. But it wasn't just desire, it was connection, understanding, an affirmation of self that neither had realized they were missing. Every shared smile, every brush of fingers under the guise of normal contact sent shivers down his spine, leaving him caught between longing and conscience. Back at home, Douglas replayed the walk in his mind, feeling the residue of that quiet electricity in his chest. He couldn't ignore the reality any longer. What he felt for Fabio was no passing fancy, no fleeting curiosity. It was deeper, more intimate, and terrifying in its intensity. Yet even as he acknowledged the truth, the fear of hurting Anne, of shattering the world he had carefully constructed, pressed down with relentless weight. That night, as he lay awake listening to the rain, both men were acutely aware that they had crossed an invisible line, one that could never be undone, and that the days ahead would demand choices neither was fully prepared to face. In the following days, Douglas and Fabio found themselves stealing moments wherever they could. Quick texts, lingering eye contact at social gatherings, and private smiles exchanged under the guise of politeness. Each encounter carried an electric weight, a thrill mingled with guilt, leaving both men restless and introspective. They laughed more freely when together, their conversations stretching into territories they had never dared explore, sharing hopes and fears that felt too vulnerable for anyone else. These moments revealed the emotional depth of their connection, one that went far beyond physical attraction, quietly affirming who they truly were. At night, when the world seemed to pause, Douglas often found himself thinking of Fabio in the quiet corners of his mind, the memory of his laughter, the touch of his hand, the way his presence seemed to ground him, all played like a private film on repeat. Simultaneously, Fabio wrestled with the intensity of feelings that had quietly infiltrated every part of his day. He loved the familiarity of home, the comfort of Andrea's presence, yet the pull toward Douglas was relentless, undeniable, and profoundly affirming. It was a strange, beautiful torment, one that left both men questioning the life they had once believed was complete. The tension between desire and responsibility became a constant undercurrent, shaping their days in subtle, persistent ways. Small gestures, a hand brushing against another's, a shared laugh over an inside joke, sent jolts of awareness through both of them, and while neither dared to speak the words aloud, both sensed that something irreversible was unfolding. Their hearts, minds, and souls were quietly entwined, teetering on the edge of revelation, and the world around them seemed oblivious to the storm quietly brewing in the spaces between their carefully curated lives. The first cracks in the carefully maintained facade appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the quiet spaces of daily life. Anne noticed Douglas's distracted glances, the way he seemed lost in thought during casual conversations, and a flicker of unease crept into her chest. She couldn't quite name it, but something was different, a tension she hadn't seen before. Across town, Andrea experienced a similar pang of uncertainty, sensing Fabio's occasional absences from focus, the way his smile sometimes didn't quite reach his eyes. The women's intuition, sharp and unyielding, began nudging at the edges of their awareness, hinting that the ordinary lives they cherished were quietly shifting beneath them. Douglas and Fabio both felt the pressure mounting, aware that their private connection was no longer just a fleeting indulgence. It was beginning to cast shadows on their outward lives. Each lingering glance or unspoken word seemed heavier now, charged with a silent warning that they were playing with fire. Douglas avoided lingering too long in conversations with Fabio, but even brief interactions left his chest tight and his mind racing. Meanwhile, Fabio tried to anchor himself in routine, in Andrea's warmth and the predictable comfort of their home, yet the emotional pull toward Douglas refused to loosen. The growing awareness of their feelings and the possibility of being discovered created a tension that neither could escape. One afternoon, during a casual gathering with friends, a moment of unintentional intimacy between Douglas and Fabio nearly exposed them. A shared joke, a brush of hands, and a look that lasted a heartbeat too long caused a brief ripple of unease in the room. Anne caught the smallest shift in Douglas's demeanor, her mind racing to reconcile the feeling of dissonance with the life she thought she knew. Similarly, Andrea's sharp eyes noticed a fleeting hesitation in Fabio's manner, a pause that didn't escape her attention. Both men realized in that instant that their private world could no longer exist untouched by the outside, and the first threads of doubt began tugging at the edges of their carefully crafted lives. The tension became almost unbearable, an invisible weight pressing on every interaction. Douglas found himself second-guessing every word, every glance, every gesture in Anne's presence, afraid that even the smallest slip might reveal what his heart was desperately trying to contain. He loved his wife, the life they had built together, but the emotional pull toward Fabio gnawed at him relentlessly, a quiet storm threatening to break through the surface. Meanwhile, Fabio wrestled with his own storm, haunted by the intensity of his feelings and the fear of shattering Andrea's trust. Every encounter with Douglas left him exhilarated and anxious in equal measure, as if each heartbeat might betray them both. Private messages became their secret refuge, brief glimpses into a world where they could breathe freely, laugh without restraint, and share thoughts that would be unthinkable in the light of day. Each text carried a weight of emotion that words alone could not capture, an affirmation, a longing, a silent, "I see you," that spoke volumes. Yet, behind the screen, guilt and fear waited patiently, reminding them of the consequences of discovery. Douglas stared at his phone long after the message was sent, heart pounding, imagining the fallout if anyone ever knew the depth of what was happening between them. Fabio, on the other end, felt the same tension, torn between exhilaration and the suffocating sense of impending doom. And then it happened, a slip, a near reveal that neither had fully anticipated. During a small family dinner, Douglas and Fabio shared a glance, subtle yet charged, that lingered just long enough for Anne and Andrea to notice the faint shift in energy. A tiny pause, a hesitant movement, a silent question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Both men realized with a jolt that the walls they had relied on were thinning, that the private world they had created was no longer immune to scrutiny. That single moment planted the seed of fear and inevitability, a whisper that the truth they had been avoiding was inching closer, and the calm, ordered lives around them were on the verge of upheaval. The following days were colored by unease, each interaction carrying an unspoken tension that neither Douglas nor Fabio could ignore. Simple routines, the morning coffee, the evening walk, the casual laughter at shared meals, felt heavier now, tinged with anticipation and fear. Every glance between them was loaded with meaning, every brush of fingers a reminder of the line they were dangerously close to crossing. Douglas felt the weight of his double life pressing down, a quiet dread that each day might bring exposure. Fabio, too, wrestled with guilt and longing, aware that each fleeting moment of connection was both a comfort and a threat. Anne and Andrea, though careful to hide their growing suspicions, began noticing the subtle cracks in their partner's behavior. A hesitation here, a distracted smile there, small, almost imperceptible cues that screamed louder than words. Both women felt a stirring of unease, the kind that wakes you in the middle of the night, that gnaws at the edges of certainty. They couldn't quite pinpoint the cause, but the feeling was persistent, insistent, demanding attention. And as Douglas and Fabio sensed the women's watchful eyes, the stakes became painfully clear. Their secret, their fragile connection, could no longer remain hidden forever. By the end of the week, the emotional turmoil had grown into a quiet storm. Douglas and Fabio, each alone with their thoughts, realized that the tension between them was no longer just about desire or curiosity. It was about identity, truth, and the impossibility of living a lie. Their private moments had created a bond neither could deny, yet the fear of what this bond could cost them hovered like a shadow over every interaction. And somewhere, in the fragile spaces of guilt, longing, and anticipation, both men knew that a reckoning was inevitable, that the next choice they made would ripple far beyond themselves, touching everyone around them in ways they could not yet foresee. The moment of truth arrived slowly, like the first ripple of a storm reaching the shore. Douglas could feel the tension coiling inside him, a mix of fear and urgency that refused to be ignored. He knew that the secret they had nurtured in stolen glances and whispered messages could no longer remain hidden. Fabio felt the same pressure, a heavy weight of anticipation and dread that made his hands tremble slightly whenever he thought of the conversation to come. The walls they had built around their hearts were cracking, and both men realized that honesty, painful as it might be, was the only path forward. When they finally met in the quiet of an empty living room, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Douglas's voice shook just slightly as he broke the silence, and Fabio mirrored the tremor, both men navigating a labyrinth of guilt, desire, and hope. They spoke of feelings that had long been suppressed, of moments that had been electric with unacknowledged meaning. There was fear, yes, but also relief, a strange, bittersweet sense of liberation that came with acknowledging the truth. Each word felt like stepping onto fragile ice, yet at the same time, it was grounding, affirming, as if admitting the impossible made it somehow real. Meanwhile, Anne and Andrea began to sense the inevitability of confrontation. Hints of tension in conversations, fleeting glances exchanged across rooms, subtle shifts in energy. They could feel something coming, a revelation that would shake the foundations of the lives they had built. Both women struggled with their intuition, trying to dismiss it while their hearts whispered otherwise. The sense of foreboding was almost tangible, a quiet hum under the surface of everyday life. And as Douglas and Fabio prepared to face what they could no longer deny, the stage was set for upheaval, heartbreak, and a confrontation that would change everything. The confessions came in fragments, halting and heavy with emotion. Douglas spoke first, his voice thick with a mixture of guilt and relief, revealing feelings he had tried so long to bury. Fabio followed, his words trembling yet resolute, acknowledging the depth of what they shared. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air was dense, charged with shock and vulnerability, as though the room itself held its breath. There was anger simmering beneath the surface, a quiet ache of betrayal that neither could ignore, yet paired with the undeniable truth of connection that could no longer be undone. Anne's reaction was immediate, a storm of hurt, confusion, and disbelief. She could barely comprehend the words, the reality clashing violently with the life she had believed so steadfastly in. Tears welled, her voice caught in her throat as she struggled to reconcile the husband she loved with the man who had sought solace elsewhere. Andrea mirrored her sister's pain, her chest tight with betrayal, yet there was also a quiet, piercing understanding that the world they had known was irrevocably shifting. Both women were swept into a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, shock, heartbreak, and the beginnings of reflection that would force them to confront their own lives and choices. The impact on family dynamics was immediate and profound. Conversations grew tense, dinners were silenced by unspoken words, and the ordinary rhythm of life fractured under the weight of truth. Friends and extended family, once a source of lightness and support, suddenly felt like a landscape of judgment and expectation. The men, though relieved to finally speak their truths, were plunged into guilt and uncertainty, grappling with the consequences of their actions. And as the dust of revelation settled, the fragile balance of love, loyalty, and desire lay exposed, setting the stage for the emotional reckoning that none of them could avoid. In the days following the confessions, the household became a landscape of raw emotion. Silence settled in corners once filled with laughter, and even the smallest gestures, pouring coffee, adjusting a chair, felt loaded with meaning. Douglas and Fabio moved carefully, each aware of the fragile threads connecting them to Anne and Andrea, and each moment carried the weight of remorse and longing. The women, meanwhile, wrestled with disappointment and heartbreak, trying to make sense of the lives they thought they knew. Their trust had been shaken, and the road to understanding felt steep and uncertain. Yet beneath the surface of pain, subtle signs of reflection began to emerge. Anne caught herself remembering moments of patience and tenderness that had always defined her marriage, and Andrea noted the quiet ways Fabio still sought to honor their shared history. Amid the shock and anger, there were glimpses of humanity, of connection that could survive even in altered forms. These moments didn't erase the hurt, but they hinted at the possibility of finding a new balance, one shaped by honesty rather than illusion. The emotional landscape was turbulent, yet within the chaos, a quiet potential for growth began to stir. Douglas and Fabio, too, felt the weight of consequence pressing down on them, but also a strange sense of liberation. No longer hiding, no longer compartmentalizing, they faced the reality of their choices and the impact those choices had wrought. There was guilt, undoubtedly, but also a clarity that came from stepping fully into truth. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with potential conflict and deep emotional work, yet for the first time, they sensed the possibility of being wholly themselves. And as the household slowly adjusted to this new, raw reality, the journey towards self-acceptance and understanding quietly began, setting the stage for what could either fracture completely or evolve into something unexpected. Douglas and Fabio stepped into the next phase of their lives with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, they could breathe without the weight of secrecy pressing on their chests. Every morning held a quiet thrill, a subtle freedom in simply being themselves, unguarded and authentic. Yet, even in this newfound clarity, the past lingered like a shadow, reminders of hurt they had caused, trust they had broken, and the delicate threads of family that still required care. Each decision now carried a dual weight, the desire to embrace truth and the responsibility to honor those whose lives had been intertwined with theirs. Anne and Andrea, in parallel, began navigating a turbulent emotional terrain of their own. Pain and betrayal gave way, slowly, to reflection and the beginnings of acceptance. Anne grappled with reshaping her understanding of love and loyalty, wondering if forgiveness could coexist with the hurt she felt so keenly. Andrea wrestled with her own identity within a shifted family landscape, realizing that the future would demand adaptation and courage. Both women faced a choice: retreat into resentment or engage with a reality they could not unsee. Small gestures, a shared cup of tea, a quiet conversation, a tentative smile, hinted at the possibility of rebuilding connections in unexpected ways. Even as emotions remained raw, a fragile rhythm began to emerge. Douglas and Fabio moved carefully, mindful of Anne and Andrea, yet committed to living authentically. Family interactions shifted subtly, some conversations heavier, some lighter, yet all carrying the imprint of honesty. The home, once a stage of polished appearances, became a space for genuine emotion, a testing ground for new dynamics. The journey ahead was uncharted, fraught with challenges and moments of doubt, but within it also lay potential for healing, growth, and the quiet joy of self-acceptance. And as the days unfolded, each character realized that truth, however painful, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but the bonds that connected them all. The family's daily life gradually began to take on a new cadence, one shaped by honesty and the need for emotional balance. Douglas and Fabio, though still navigating guilt and lingering tension, found comfort in small, unguarded moments, shared laughter, quiet support, and the simple act of existing without pretense. Each interaction with Anne and Andrea carried layers of care and thoughtfulness, an acknowledgement of the hurt caused, but also of the bonds that could still be nurtured. The men discovered that living authentically required not just courage, but patience and empathy, a deliberate effort to repair what had been strained. Anne, too, started to explore her own emotions more deeply, uncovering strength she hadn't realized she possessed. She reflected on her life, her marriage, and the complexities of love, discovering that anger and hurt could coexist with compassion and understanding. Andrea, similarly, wrestled with the tension between loyalty, grief, and the acceptance of change, realizing that life didn't have to follow a rigid script. Both sisters found themselves confronting difficult truths about human desire and imperfection, understanding that the family they had known might evolve in ways previously unimaginable. Slowly, moments of genuine connection began to reemerge. Shared meals became opportunities to speak and listen more honestly, while laughter returned in cautious, yet heartfelt bursts. The emotional walls that once seemed insurmountable began to shift, allowing space for reflection, dialogue, and even unexpected warmth. The family's new dynamic was fragile, yet it was real, grounded in acknowledgement and courage. And in the midst of this evolving reality, Douglas and Fabio felt the quiet thrill of living in alignment with themselves, while Anne and Andrea, though still processing, glimpsed the possibility of acceptance, setting the stage for gradual healing and the hope of a more honest, if imperfect, harmony. Over time, the household began to breathe with a tentative ease, each person learning the rhythm of coexistence in a new, honest reality. Douglas and Fabio, while still navigating the aftermath of their choices, found a quiet satisfaction in living openly, embracing the emotional truth they had long denied. Their interactions were no longer furtive, and the tension that had once defined them softened into understanding and mutual respect. Every glance, every word, every small gesture now carried authenticity, a reflection of hearts aligned with their true selves. Anne and Andrea, too, discovered unexpected resilience. Though the sting of betrayal lingered, both women began recognizing the humanity and vulnerability in Douglas and Fabio's choices. They explored their own identities, desires, and boundaries, realizing that their love for family could coexist with disappointment and hurt. Slowly, the bonds that had been strained began to take new forms, some strengthened by honesty, others reshaped, yet all bearing the imprint of truth. The family's interactions shifted from performance to connection, a delicate balance of forgiveness, patience, and authentic engagement. In these quiet, unassuming moments, shared laughter at dinner, tentative smiles exchanged in hallways, and simple gestures of care, the family discovered a fragile but real harmony. The future remained uncertain, tinged with the complexities of love, loyalty, and self-discovery, yet within it also lay the promise of genuine happiness. Each character, scarred but wiser, stepped forward into a world where truth could no longer be hidden, yet offered the profound freedom of authenticity. And as they embraced the evolving reality of their lives, the quiet hope of renewal lingered, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the enduring possibility of love in all its complicated forms.